Dear Father in heaven, thank you for the week that we've shared together. I pray that you'll be with us as you promised, Lord, but in a special way as we enter into your Sabbath hours, Lord. As we come together to spend this day together and with you that you set apart, I pray, Lord, that we'll be right in our hearts towards each other and towards you. And Lord, that you might pour your rain down upon us. Lord, as you promised, your latter rain. I pray, Lord, that none will go home thirsty. Lord, may we be ripened as grain, as you would have us to be prepared for the times that are coming. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. This morning we went back over this idea of information age. We saw one of the main things that we were identifying was these four battles that 2016 marked the first of the four. And from then on we're trying to understand what that can teach us about the war that we're facing. And as we've suggested, you can tie much of this, or really everything that we know in the future, we can seem to tie back to the time of the end. Not just the time of the end, but this period of the increase of knowledge. So we began that journey by going back to 1989 and seeing an important invention, what they call the Big Bang of the information age, when it really took off, and that was the invention of the World Wide Web. We can mark 10 years before the time of the end. 10 years marking a test, something God's people should have identified. Going back to 1979, we've already spoken about the Pope, and we have spoken about the Afghanistan war. Now we're recognizing the beginning of the FISA court, that top secret court in the United States that gives permission to the government agencies to conduct surveillance of US citizens. And under that FISA court, they've accepted over 35,000 applications for surveillance and rejected 12. We also see Smith versus Maryland, a famous court case where it was decided that surveillance of communications over phone records back in 1979 was not a violation of the Constitution. 1969, you can go back another 10 years and recognize the invention of the internet. Then we tracked this invention of the World Wide Web, the first web browser in 1990 and then released in 1991. So really we have three markers for these years: our increase of knowledge, the fall of the USSR, and the invention of the World Wide Web. Then in 1996 we see Moonlight Maze, the beginning of Russian hacking, and we're going to discuss that a little bit more. 9/11, we discussed the Patriot Act. What we could see at 9/11 was the government start to violate the constitutional rights of its citizens by essentially turning into a police state. And since 9/11, under George Bush and Obama and Trump, you have seen this violation of the Constitution. I'll neaten as we go. What we will do tonight, is finish up this study into what war looks like in our time. I'm hoping to complete that study tonight. In 2004, we saw James Comey and Robert Mueller restrict the President of the United States from extending the Patriot Act. So we see a restriction in 2004. And as we've suggested, as we've said, these are all waymarks on our reform line. This made us consider next 2014. And what we saw in 2014 was really a neat parallel of what was happening internally in that time. 2012, it comes out of Britain, this group, and it enters the US market. The same way message came out of Britain, entered the United States. We see that it is not accepted, the message not accepted by the leadership, and also this method of this further restriction of a Patriot Act could not be accepted by the US government at that time either, under Obama and the Democrats. Then in 2013, the work of the enemies, internally Path of the Just, externally Edward Snowden. And then 2014 we see was a waymark, an event, despite those two obstacles. So in 2014 it became our Sunday law, and in 2014 the Constitution was violated by the gathering of this mass data. To understand what happened in 2014, we had to again go back to the time of the end and consider this man Nigel Oakes, where this British company first began. It began in 1989 with Nigel Oakes beginning the study of human behaviour and how to manipulate that behaviour. But he had a background in television, so he's also considering how to manipulate that behaviour based on these visual and audible messages. In 1990, he forms the Behavioural Dynamics Institute, pretty much just building up his company. And then in 1992, he forms Strategic Communications Laboratories, known as the SCL. Strategic Communication Laboratory, a fancy sounding name. What they really were just mercenaries for hire, using this study of how to manipulate human behaviour. And then we saw that exhibit in 2005 where they showcased what they could do, how they could bring about deception on a huge scale of millions of people to change their behaviour to what the government wanted to see. They entered the US market in 2012 after years of working either in war zones or in developing countries where there was not a free and open media setup. Then we discussed a few people. We discussed the CEO of the company, Alexander Nix. Now I'm hoping that a video can be shared around of Alexander Nix speaking at a conference in 2016. A couple of months, less than 2 months before the US election in November of 2016, Alexander Nix gave a speech to a very prestigious meeting that was actually first brought about as a result of 9/11, and in this presentation he gives to some of the world's most powerful people, he showcases what his company can do. So you really hear from the man himself what his company can do. That man was Alexander Nix. Then we discussed Christopher Wiley, who started working for that company in 2013, and how Christopher Wiley and Alexander Nix took this new technology they were developing to Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon, this interesting fellow who we discussed, has a worldview that we can partly agree with, that we are in a fourth great turning point of American history, from the US Revolution, the US Civil War, World War II, and right now in what he describes as an information or culture war. When it comes to that, I find a lot I agree with. What he needed to fight this information war was an information weapon. And what is an information weapon? It has to be a little bit tricky to describe. But what they developed in 2014 was what Christopher Wiley describes as his culture or information weapon. And that was done by taking data points on, they claim, 126 million Americans, and then breaking down the personality of each one of those people to where they know your fears and hopes, and they can begin to manipulate your behavior. Over the course of all of that research, Steve Bannon was the vice president of this new company known as Cambridge Analytica. So acting as vice president, his role really was to oversee the development that was happening, and also to make sure that it was being used for his own agenda, the agenda of far-right politics in the United States. There is no way that such a development as he was overseeing was going to end up in the hands of their opposition, the opposite side in that informational culture war. So from 2004, we mark 2014, and this company, Cambridge Analytica. Christopher Wiley, who was one of their main data researchers, really oversaw that development, turned into a whistleblower. And he's given us much of the information that we now have, but much of this information has also been confirmed straight from their own mouth as what we described as that media sting, where they pretended to be a political party. Couple of reminders of the methodology that they use. When Nigel Oakes said we use the same techniques as Aristotle and Hitler. We appeal to people on an emotional level to get them to agree on a functional level. And Mark Turnbull, it sounds like a dreadful thing to say, but these are things that don't necessarily need to be true as long as they're believed. You put those two things together, and what they can do is tell you lies to impact your emotions to change your behavior. And we understand that that was this science that was developing under Cambridge Analytica was used not only in Donald Trump's election campaign, but also in Brexit. The two fronts in this war, London and Texas. When he says Texas, he's talking really about those southern Bible states that are generally conservative. This is really what I wanted us to consider. 2014, you see the development of this weapon, and in 2016, it's fired. Cambridge Analytica begins to work for Donald Trump's campaign. As we saw, they started to feed him these phrases that they developed back here, phrases like drain the swamp or build the wall, that they knew would create this emotional response. And it has done that very effectively. It really has, it made a large difference in his campaign, even Donald Trump himself acknowledging that when he said these phrases, he could feel the emotion rise up from the crowd during his campaign rallies. Because he's now able to tell people what they want to hear. They set up in 2013 was the setting up of two companies that really were built out of SCL. One was Cambridge Analytica, and the other one is known as Aggregate IQ. They like names that don't really say what they do. Aggregate IQ, set up in 2013, comes out of Canada. They try to pretend that they're not linked to SCL or Cambridge Analytica. But the problem is that they use Cambridge Analytica's logo on their documents, and that an internal staff list from the SCL group showed the president of Aggregate IQ listed as the head of SCL Canada. It's Aggregate IQ that oversaw Brexit, and it's Cambridge Analytica that oversaw Trump's election. So this is really also a target, not on just the political establishment in the United States, as Steve Bannon would say, but now it's the political establishment worldwide. Now he's also trying to take down the European Union, which began to happen under Brexit. Then we considered the war in heaven and how that played out, how this manipulated information connected with strong emotion is what combined to when we saw the first war. So when we talk about a Sunday law in 2014, what we're talking about is a breakdown in constitutional rights. And we also began to see that with the Patriot Act. What Cambridge Analytica did was in a large degree what the US government was doing under the Patriot Act, but now it's on a much larger scale with much more sinister motives. So this is really what was developing for Trump's election. How does Russia then come into this story? First of all, you can tie Russia to Cambridge Analytica. The scientist who gave them the Facebook data for the 80 million Americans was born in Moldova under the Soviet Union and has ties to Russia. And all of what Cambridge Analytica was building in this time period was also being shared with Russian oil companies for reasons they have not explained why. So we know Russia was aware of what was happening under Cambridge Analytica. But this is really, I'm not suggesting that it was the Russians that conducted this development. But their paths run very close together. A man named Thomas Rid, a British researcher and professor, began to look into this incident, Moonlight Maze, that happened in 1996, Moonlight Maze. And he released a book on that incident in 2016. He says, Russians hacked Colorado in 2014, but they started in 1996. The 1996 incident at the Colorado School of Mines was not known to the public until a British researcher and professor named Thomas Rid found out about it through an open records request and wrote about it in a book that was released in 2016. So the Moonlight Maze wasn't public knowledge until fairly recently. And this man, Thomas Rid, discovered it and released a book in 2016. What Thomas Rid says is that the future began with Moonlight Maze. Espionage now looks more like Moonlight Maze than anything that we saw during the Cold War. It really was the beginning of the new era, and it's never really stopped. So what he has recognized is that you had one type of behavior under the Cold War, and now in 1996 you see a new behavior on these online platforms. And he's tying together two important dates, 1996 and 2014. Russia hacked into the United States systems, into NASA, etc. in 1996. But they began hacking again in 2014. In 2014, top US cyber defenders engaged in a battle, what they describe as a battle with Russian hackers who had breached the unclassified State Department computer systems and displayed a level of aggression that experts warn is likely to be turned against the private sector, and an unexpected level of aggression. So Russian hacking 1996, they start showing this level of aggression in 2014. As Thomas Rid said, that level of aggression hasn't stopped since 2014. What Russia did was hack into the State Department computers, and then over 24 hours it became this battle between the NSA, the US government agency, and these Russian hackers. As the US, the NSA tried to remove these hackers from their computer systems. It was described as hand-to-hand combat. They pretty much just rotated their staff as they tried to fight for supremacy online on these computer systems. They even had hacked into the video feed of these hackers, so they were watching the Russians in the room as they were hacking into US computers. Eventually, the NSA was able to remove them from its software. The State Department shut down its email system for 2 days, pretending that it was for maintenance. That was just a pretense to avoid showing what they were trying to do, and that was to remove the Russians from their computer systems. This assertiveness by Russia in 2014 showed a general shift to becoming more aggressive in the use of cyber tools. In 2015 and 2016, Russian spy agencies hacked the Democratic National Committee's computers and launched an active measures campaign to disrupt the 2016 presidential election. What that is saying is that this level of aggression of hacking that began in 2014 by Russia only escalated. In 2015 and 2016, they hacked the DNC, the really the headquarters of the Democrats. The Democrats trying to bring in Hillary Clinton. The Democrats were trying to bring in Hillary Clinton, and Vladimir Putin begins hacking in 2014, and then in 2015 begins hacking into her political party's private computers, also hacking into email accounts of those on her campaign party, and then releasing that information. Why would Vladimir Putin want to stop Hillary Clinton becoming president? Why would he be in 2015 and 2016 working against Hillary Clinton? We understand in 2014 we can mark an alliance between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, but what do they have in common? Why would Vladimir Putin think Donald Trump is going to serve his interests more as president than Clinton would? I would suggest that we need to go back to 2011. On our reform line, we mark 2001, 9/11, and then we mark 2004. And this is the beginning of the laying of the foundations. Next we mark 2014. And these become waymarks for our reform line. I would suggest that this is a chiastic structure. If we mark 2001 to 2004, we cannot ignore the events of 2011. A 3-year period and a 3-year period from 2001 to 2004 when the foundations begin to be laid, and 2014 back to 2011. This is a chiasm. So what happened in 2011? Vladimir Putin entered government in 1999, and he entered it not by election but by the stepping down of Boris Yeltsin. And then the very first president he meets is Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton's husband. And that relationship is is immediately not on friendly terms. Vladimir Putin is smarting from the breakdown of the Soviet Union still, and when he meets Bill Clinton, you can see in his behaviour that he's not overly impressed to meet the leader of the free world. Then he's elected in 2000. In 2001, he begins to consolidate power. What he does over 2000, 2001, in those early years, is bring those Russian powerful billionaires, the oligarchs, under control. When the Soviet Union broke down, really it went from the state owning everything to now people could buy it up individually. And because their economy was so poor, just a few people bought up all of the state's resources, and huge amounts, hugely powerful companies, oil companies, all of these things were bought up by just a few people, and these people, for a very little effort, became billionaires overnight, and they're known as the Russian oligarchs. It wasn't so easy. If you saw another man trying to buy the same company at these deflated prices, they tended to also have each other killed. It was quite a bloodbath. But what resulted out of the breakdown of the Soviet Union was that you had a few people having control over much of the country's resources who were billionaires and extremely powerful. So Vladimir Putin comes in as president, and he needs these oligarchs on his side. So what he does is he takes the richest man, the very richest oligarch he could find, and he arrests him for charges of corruption, different charges, and then he puts him on trial in a cage, and then he puts that trial on television and has it broadcast countrywide. So now all of the oligarchs, from him being the richest, all the oligarchs down, decreasing in wealth, can see someone more wealthy than them in a cage on trial, and they're scared because they're all corrupt. They could all end up in a cage on trial. So they want to know how Vladimir Putin is going to protect them. How can they make sure that they're on the right side of this new president who is already stamping down on corruption? So what Vladimir Putin does in the early years of his presidency, when those oligarchs come to him and tell him, what do we have to do to not be arrested? He tells them, I want 50% of everything you have. So these Russian billionaires now give 50% of everything that they have to Vladimir Putin, not the Russian government or any of that, but to Vladimir Putin as an individual. And that's how we could say that he's worth $200 to $500 billion, is because he has brought the oligarchs under him. In those earlier years, he also brings in the Russian mafia, and now the Russian mafia and their secret agencies are pretty much the same thing. If the Russian mafia do something, it's coming from Vladimir Putin. If a Russian oligarch is talking to Donald Trump's campaign team, he's doing that for Vladimir Putin. They all answer to Putin, or they die under suspicious circumstances on a London street, as many have. So in those early years, Vladimir Putin is really, setting his country up for dictatorship, bringing everyone under his control. And then you also have that awful siege, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the town, but you have a siege in Germany where Chechen terrorists took over a school with hundreds of children. In Russia, with hundreds of Russian children as hostages, mostly children and also some of their parents. And instead of negotiating with terrorists, Vladimir Putin sent in tanks, guns, couple of hundred little children died under the Russian gunfire, ordered by Vladimir Putin. The rest that didn't die by the terrorists died in the subsequent fire. As an excuse for that, Vladimir Putin, in around 2004-2005, then established more of a dictatorship. So those early years are the rise of Vladimir Putin. This doesn't go entirely unnoticed, and he begins to make enemies in the West. The West is noticing what he's doing, and he begins to be somewhat unpopular by some people. Hillary Clinton makes the mistake of saying what she thinks of this man, and she says at one stage, she makes the statement that Vladimir Putin is a former KGB agent, therefore he has no soul. He doesn't have a soul. She's that strong in her language against Vladimir Putin, and they become sworn enemies. In 2009, Vladimir Putin is no longer president. Now, as we saw, it's Medvedev. So Hillary Clinton decides, along with Barack Obama, decide they're going to restart this relationship with Russia. And from 2009 to 2011, you have this attempt to restart the relationship between the United States and Russia. They think they can all be friends again now that there's Obama and Medvedev. It's a new start. So Hillary Clinton gives the Russian foreign minister, I think it was the Russian foreign minister, I'm trying to remember, a red button. It was symbolic of a new start. They would press this button together and say, we're restarting the clock. Now we're friends. That lasted all of 2 years. In 2011, we have Arab Spring, what is known as the Arab Spring. These are popular uprisings, revolutions across the Arab world, from Egypt to Libya to Syria. A couple of the main ones we should mention. Out of these popular uprisings spring a few things that are still significant for us today. Out of Arab Spring, those revolutions, came the Syrian civil war. That is now a proxy war between the United States and Russia. A repeat of Afghanistan. Out of Arab Spring also came the fall of Libya under Gaddafi. Gaddafi was the dictator of Libya, and he was an ally of Vladimir Putin. Under Hillary Clinton's orders, the CIA went into Libya, used that social unrest to topple Gaddafi. And Gaddafi, the CIA had promised that Gaddafi would not die, he would be protected. Instead, Gaddafi died a pretty awful death, and it was recorded on video and shared on the internet. So an ally of Vladimir Putin, under Hillary Clinton's orders, is toppled and murdered on video. Vladimir Putin is said to have watched that video of his death on repeat 3 times and then stand up and say, never again. What is he saying never again to? Never again is the United States going to practice regime change on an ally. The United States has conducted regime change more often than it would like to admit, and it did that in Libya to Gaddafi. Hillary Clinton, again, not good with her words, hears of Gaddafi's death and says to a reporter, we came, we saw, he died. A repeat of the Roman phrase, we came, we saw, we conquered. She says, we came, we saw, he died. Not very sympathetic to this ally of Vladimir Putin. All of this makes Vladimir Putin very, very angry. Again, if we consider the Syrian civil war, when Vladimir Putin says never again, is an ally going to be topped? He's also watching another ally in Syria. This is Assad. He watches his ally in Syria battling. And Vladimir Putin, he knows he has the knowledge that the United States was behind 1989 to 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. So when he sees the people rising up, he believes that is the work of the United States. So he blames the United States for all of the Arab Spring, all of these revolutions in these countries across the Arab world. I think we've already spoken of this other point. In 2011, Vladimir Putin was not yet president again, but he announces that he's coming back as president. He announces his comeback. And what happens when he announces his comeback? The largest protests inside Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union. People take to the streets in their thousands to try and prevent him coming back. The largest protests since 1991. And again, Hillary Clinton, she shouldn't have spoken. Really knowing what comes in the future, she perhaps should not have spoken. But she starts encouraging these protests, saying the Russian people have a right to take to the street. They have a right to say we don't want Putin back and we don't want a dictator. But that gives Vladimir Putin extra ammunition to see the United States behind his attempted removal. So he's watched on video his closest, one of his good allies, die a horrific death, and now he thinks they're coming for me. Now they're going to do the exact same thing to me that they're trying to do in Syria, that they did in Libya, that they did in Iraq. The United States has practiced regime change against these dictatorships, and he thinks he's next. So not only is he scared in 2001, he's also very, very angry. And it's in 2001 you can start to see his behaviour change towards the 2011, you start to see his behaviour change towards the United States. From 2001 forward, he does not give an inch to the United States, not in Syria or in the Ukraine or in any of these other ways. So you can mark Vladimir Putin really setting off on his path towards interfering with Hillary Clinton's election in 2011. Something else happens in 2011. In 2009, Donald Trump joins Twitter. This is his favourite political platform, to send out these short tweets. His lawyer once spoke to the media and said that the reason that Donald Trump communicates with his people via tweets is because he expects that if the government ever tries to remove him, say for collusion, working with Russia in the campaign, that the people will rise up and save Donald Trump. So the way Donald Trump uses social media is to build up a following, and that following is used in the case of his attempted removal. For the people to protect the president in such a situation would require civil war. So Donald Trump is already preparing for civil war. And in 2011, Donald Trump begins to use Twitter as a political platform to share his ideas on politics, to attack Barack Obama, something that he hasn't stopped to do since. So in 2011 we can mark this anger in Vladimir Putin. So when it comes to 2015 and Hillary Clinton declares that she's going to run for office, the last thing that Vladimir Putin wants is Hillary Clinton as President of the United States, because she will not serve Russia's interests. She's taken a very hard line on him for many, many years, and he knows that he's only going to face increasing sanctions. So in 2014, he begins this hacking, testing the strength of the US computer systems. And then 2015 and 2016, he begins to meddle in the US election. How he does that is by hacking into Hillary Clinton's political party and to her own emails and the emails of her those on her campaign, and then using those emails in a particularly, that information in a strategic way. They begin really this attack on Hillary Clinton, and it wasn't just by releasing information. What he also started to do was spread lies about her. So you may have heard of stories saying that Hillary Clinton is a pedophile and that she practiced this behavior in a basement of a pizza restaurant. These crazy stories came out of Russia. What the Russian media would do is what his secret agencies would do is they would invent a story damaging to Hillary Clinton, then they would release it on the dark web, on the internet, but on that portion of the internet where you can't see who is saying what. It can't be traced back to a source. And then they promote that story until it swells, until it reaches pockets of the American public, and then it reaches the mass media, and particularly gets taken up by, like we mentioned, Breitbart News, these far-right leaning news sources. So it's also this spread of lies about Hillary Clinton. If anything, that was more damaging. Around this election time period, he starts to, he uses this information in a very strategic way. That information is released through WikiLeaks, much of it. WikiLeaks is really, it's hard to describe. It's headed by a man named Julian Assange, who is, of all things, an Australian. Brilliant man, absolutely brilliant. And in his early years, he became a computer hacker. He learned how to hack, and he did it for fun. And then, brilliant man, but I would suggest personality-wise, not quite right. He realizes that he can also use his hacking skills against governments, and he has a sense of power in doing that. And what he has done since then, now WikiLeaks is a network of hackers that are from all over the world that work, they say, against corrupt governments. So when they receive information against a government, they will pretty much what Edward Snowden did. Also, what Julian Assange will do, they'll find these people willing to talk and release top secret information that's damaging to particular governments. The one thing the one government Julian Assange never attacks is Russia. WikiLeaks and Julian Assange have pretty much been very close allies of Vladimir Putin. The computer servers for WikiLeaks come out of Russia. Edward Snowden, who we discussed, is in hiding in Russia because Julian Assange told him he would be safe in Russia. So it's WikiLeaks and Julian Assange that are used to, again, attack Hillary Clinton and the Democrat Party. So this is the behavior of Russia during this time period, interfering in the 2016 election, and their interference has been able to be proven quite solidly. So when we consider 2016 as a battle, it's the Battle of Ipsus. How is Vladimir Putin attacking the United States? First of all, with an ally, Donald Trump. Now he's working with who becomes the President of the United States. But it's through information. It's through not only taking information and then releasing it, taking damaging information and releasing it through hacking. It's also in spreading lies. And it's this spread of lies that has started to drive a wedge in the United States. Now you have so much anger developing because once these lies are spread, some of them are so extreme, like these ideas of Hillary Clinton being a pedophile, that it really makes people angry on both sides. Now one side is angry that she's a pedophile and the other side is so angry that people are even believing this kind of news. So now you end up having two streams of information, two totally separate news sources, and a rift in the American public, a rift between the cities and the country, between black and white, between male and female. Any division that you could find starts to be driven apart by these news stories. It's not that different to what the United States has done in conducting regime change. It's not that different to what they actually did against the Soviet Union in spreading stories through the solidarity movement. But there is a bit of a difference in behaviour. Vladimir Putin doesn't seem to be that well driven by his conscience, and some of these stories are quite extreme. Back before the Soviet Union fell, we understand that the Soviet Union invented the story that the United States was behind the AIDS virus, and then they placed that story very carefully in a newspaper in India, and then they promoted that story over a number of years until they pretty much fed its growth into the United States, and it just took off. And it still exists today. Many people today still think that the United States invented the AIDS virus as a weapon. That's a story that is disinformation out of the Soviet Union. And it's the same type of behaviour that we see happening in 2016. But now what took years back before the invention of the World Wide Web can happen in a matter of hours. That is what I would suggest is the battle that we see. I want us to take a moment. We're going to wrap up this concept of war. And I want us to just wrap up what we were considering this morning about the Cold War. What happened in the Cold War and brought about the fall of the Soviet Union. And this has less to do with history and more to do with how we understand lines of prophecy and how we apply those histories when it comes to the 21st century. So 1945, the end of World War II, and the beginning of World War III on one sense, on one scale. Then we see the relationship, this union that existed between Britain and the United States and Russia that ended World War II starts to come apart as Stalin takes more and more of Eastern Europe. Just to remind us of this history. In 1946, Churchill states that an iron curtain has descended across Europe. 1947, the relationship just completely breaks apart until the death of Stalin 6 years after that. 1949, the USSR develops nuclear weapons. Now you have two nuclear powers. And I would suggest that's when you have two nuclear powers that you truly have a Cold War. Because what made it a Cold War? What made it a Cold War was the concept we discussed this morning of MAD. M-A-D. Mutually assured destruction. Now that you have two nuclear powers, it's too dangerous to attack your enemy. Because once they attack you, you're finished. This isn't a war of the trenches like World War I that can go on for year after year after year. It's one blow and it's over. This is an article from the BBC from 2012 titled, "How Did We Forget About Mutually Assured Destruction?" It says, for many analysts, the world is now a less stable place than it was during that Cold War time period. All the major geopolitical confrontations still revolve around nuclear weapons. What they go on to describe is that this dynamic of MAD has not changed, and they say the ghost of MAD, mutually assured destruction, remains. The only difference is now we choose not to think about it. Putin has led Russia for 19 years, and he's an incredibly intelligent man. He is smart to maintain power, gain power, and then maintain power the way he has. He's incredibly intelligent. He knows that this dynamic still exists, that if he's antagonistic towards the United States, Donald Trump is just a button away from ending the existence of Russia as a continent. Some say that this dynamic has changed because you're constantly hearing stories in the news about some massive, new, impressive weapon that Putin claims to have, or that some analyst somewhere thinks he has. And they say that this has changed. I would suggest that it hasn't. I would suggest these stories are for a different purpose. Russian doctrine is based on the idea of deception. And many people don't even believe these weapons exist. It's part of their propaganda machine. What Donald Trump is also setting up in 2016 with these stories against Hillary Clinton and these attacks on the West is a cult of personality. The same thing that is set up by every dictator, that was set up by Hitler and Stalin to make sure that people are tied to them. They paint this story of themselves as this person who's there to drain the swamp, to clean out corruption, to protect you from the danger of immigrants. They spin these stories to create this idea of a personality that doesn't actually exist. It actually becomes a form of a cult. The other thing, you could call that that what he is also setting up is a propaganda machine. And now you have news channels that have been taken over by Donald Trump that are sharing his worldview. The reason they're sharing his worldview is because they're right-leaning, because it appeals to their fears in the same way. They're the right-leaning news sources like Breitbart News. InfoWars. These are not news sources. If there was a volcano exploding in front of you and they wanted to tell you it wasn't exploding, they would. And they try and spin you that story. These sources do not provide us with news. But he's also building up propaganda machines that are more conventional news sources, but ones leading towards his political party. So you see this propaganda machine building up in that time period. And this is something that Vladimir Putin has, as a dictator, set up at the very beginning, as you would need to. In 2000, he starts setting up this cult of personality and propaganda machine, where the state media, where you just have a state media. What Vladimir Putin set up was Russia Today. Russia Today, known as RT, a very clever propaganda machine. I would not trust any news story that came out of Russia Today. The way they manipulate information and the fact that they can share lies alongside proofs. For example, spinning the idea that Russia never invaded the Ukraine, those types of stories, and then claim to provide proof that there were no Russian soldiers in the Ukraine. Those types of stories, you have to be very careful what you trust. Why did we go there? We were talking about propaganda machines. Yes, Vladimir Putin, he has a propaganda machine. And he also has a cult of personality, and this is how he has to maintain control over his own country. So he has to make sure his own people think that he's this strong, powerful ruler. So when he gets up and says that he's got all these wonderful new weapons, that Russia is now unbeatable because they can bypass the defense systems of the United States, it's interesting that he makes those claims as he did earlier this year, 17 days before his re-election. This was part of his election campaign. This information that he shares is not for the benefit of the United States or Europe. It's for the benefit of his own people and maintaining control in his own country. Another reason we can be fairly assured is, as we described before, US defense spending in 2016, $611 billion, and Russia, $69.2 billion. Does not keep up. Also, the United States economy, if we talk about economy, is worth $20 trillion. Approximately $20 trillion. That's the US. Russia is 1.7. Significantly disadvantaged when it comes to defense spending and really this level of protection. I'm hoping when you watch these documentaries that you're interested to learn about a man named Bill Browder. Bill Browder made hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars at the breakdown of the Soviet Union in the same way the Russian oligarchs did. He became one of those people who went in and bought up all those state resources. But he came out of England. He came out of the United States via England. Bill Browder started to notice corruption in those early years as Putin became president. And at first he would report the corruption, and the perpetrators of that corruption would be arrested and dealt with. And then one day he notices some corruption. Bill Browder notices some strange money figures, and he alerts the police services that he was required to alert. All of a sudden, Bill Browder is in a great deal of danger. What he doesn't realize at that point in time is that Vladimir Putin had just made a deal with the oligarchs for 50% of everything they have. So Bill Browder sees corruption, and that corruption ties back to the oligarchs. So he sees corruption. And the corruption he identifies and reports goes back to some powerful people. But the problem is that when he reported that behavior prior to Vladimir Putin's deal, those people would then get charged. But now now Vladimir Putin owns 50%. So now this corruption doesn't just tie back to there, now it ties back to Putin himself. So does Vladimir Putin want to uncover corruption anymore? No, he wants to protect those people who are corrupt, now not report them. So Bill Browder is then charged with tax evasion himself. He's chased out of Russia. He flees Russia empties his bank accounts and flees Russia knowing that his life is in danger. He flees, but he leaves inside Russia his lawyer, a man named Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky is the lawyer for Bill Browder at that point in time. And Magnitsky is trying to clear Bill Browder's name and get to the bottom of this corruption. For this lawyer's attempt to reveal this corruption, he's arrested and placed in a Russian jail. They torture him repeatedly to try and get him to sign a document saying that he was behind the corruption. Under torture, he refuses to sign that document. In the end, he, after months of abuse, under Vladimir Putin's orders, Magnitsky is beaten to death in a Russian jail cell. So Bill Browder has escaped Russia. He hears word that his lawyer, who was still a fairly young man, married with 2 children, has just been killed on the orders of Vladimir Putin. And Bill Browder is now a very wealthy, very angry man. And Bill Browder describes himself, I would say fairly accurately, as Vladimir Putin's number 1 enemy. Now it's Bill Browder versus Vladimir Putin. What Bill Browder then went and did is he went to governments in the West, because Vladimir Putin holds at $200 to $500 billion. And by the way, the person saying it's $500 billion is Bill Browder, and he knows how much money is circulating among those oligarchs. He goes to those Western countries and he brings in a type of sanctions. It's known as a Magnitsky Act. He names it after his lawyer that died. This is a Magnitsky Act. And it's justice for his lawyer that Vladimir Putin had killed. These Magnitsky Acts, they pretty much, if your blood flow was Vladimir Putin's money between the West and where he can access it in Russia, he's pretty much just clamped it. Now, when a country passes a Magnitsky Act, what they're stopping is those oligarchs that they know are corrupt, the oligarchs that were involved in the death of Magnitsky and Vladimir Putin, from accessing their money in the West. So now, what Vladimir Putin has been trying to get Trump to do, and you can see this in their meetings, is Putin is trying to get Donald Trump to end these Magnitsky Acts. This is about money. He does not want to take down the US economy. He wants his money back because the West has his money. When one of the things that Robert Mueller, in his Russian investigation, is looking into is a meeting that occurred between Trump's son-in-law, members of Trump's campaign team, and a Russian lawyer. And that meeting, it occurred between Trump's campaign team, the head of his campaign and his son-in-law, and a Russian lawyer, was all about the Russians trying to persuade Donald Trump that if he won victory, if they helped him win, he was going to end Magnitsky Acts in the United States. Earlier this year, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin met in person in a meeting for the first time. And what did Putin ask of Trump? Only one thing. Putin only asked of Trump one thing that came out in that meeting, and that was, let my agencies have access to Bill Browder. This is the man he's chasing, and it's about money. Which brings us to a new concept of MAD. Mutually assured destruction has become mutually assured economic destruction. Hitting the United States with a weapon, taking down its infrastructure, none of that helps him get his money back. What he needs is an ally to repeal these acts, and if that ally doesn't comply, what helps is if you have blackmail material. Blackmail is information. So the Cold War is really this history of mutually assured destruction, and you could trace all kinds of waymarks what happened in that period of the Cold War. It almost became hot, they almost went to war, then they stepped back. But it's pretty much that history of mutually assured destruction. Under a Cold War, you can see a proxy war. And in 1979, you see the beginning of the Afghanistan proxy war. When we looked at the counterfeit, we began to trace the fall that occurred between 1979 and 1989. We could see this fall occurring as Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul II combined made that effort to defeat the King of the South. What I want us to consider is Daniel 11 verse 40. Thank you. If you would open your Bibles to Daniel 11 verse 40 and read it with me. You ready to read with me? Daniel 11 verse 40. And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over. So at the time of the end, that's 1798, shall the king of the south push against the king of the north. And then the king of the north shall come against the king of the south like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. So with military and economic strength, the king of the north is going to come against the king of the south and defeat him. My question, pretend that you haven't learnt any of external events since, let's give it a midway point, 1984. Let's say you haven't learnt any external events since 1984. You're in this history. You are standing in that year. But you understand time setting, how it works, and you understand Daniel 11 verse 40. How do you read that? You've then understood that this is going to be November 9, 1989. Now you have a day. And on that day in 1989, you know that the King of the North, that the United States is going to come against the King of the South, and he's going to come against him with military and economic strength. What are you expecting to see on November 9, 1989? Hot war. You're expecting to see something impressive. At the very, very least, you're expecting to see the United States on that day. All you see on that day is an internal revolution, a bubbling up from the inside that causes a wall, the Berlin Wall, to open for a few hours and then shut again. Where is the United States on November 9, 1989? It's not there. To understand what happened on this day, you had to understand this prior history. You had to understand the Cold War. It was only in understanding what this war was about. Remember our concept from World War II. This is about war, not battle. And there are many battles between 1945 and 1989 when it comes to information. But if you understand it instead as a whole period of time, you will only understand 1945 because you understand the war that was going on between Germany and Russia. You only understand this day in 1989 because we understand the Cold War. So the only reason you know that it was the United States that was working against Russia, against the Soviet Union on that day, was because you understood that it was that it was the United States that had been causing this build-up from the inside, this public dissatisfaction that was resulting essentially in the beginnings of revolution, the beginnings of the revolution that ended the Soviet Union, essentially. If we go back to Daniel 11 verse 13, if you'll read that with me. Daniel 11 verse 13 is telling us about the Battle of Raphia.
For the king of the Lord will contend and shall set up another king greater than the former. And I shall set him down at the great army and march.
The Battle of Raphia, the king of the north comes against the king of the south, and with a great army, with a lot of money, and is victorious. So what are we expecting at the Battle of Raphia? We have been expecting a hot war. But when you put that in the context of Daniel 11 verse 40, we have to look to the fulfillment of these verses to understand how to apply them. And where God has been kind to us, He's given us examples, not just 2016 to show us what a battle looks like in application, but He's also given us 1989 to understand what He's now talking about when He talks about war. This battle stemmed from the Cold War. It was a result of years of the United States subverting the Soviet Union from the inside. What is happening right now is Vladimir Putin is subverting the US government, the US Constitution, everything that has made America great from the inside. So we need to consider 1989 when we're trying to understand the Battle of Raphia. I would suggest we can take it one step further. Daniel 11:40. We understand that its work has not been completed because of the king of the south has not been fully defeated. So when is Daniel 11 verse 40 completed? When is the king of the south killed? Is it the Battle of Raphia? No. So what now are we suggesting? So I tried to make the point to prepare us for it when we looked at Pyrrhus. That when we were considering when we were considering 1989, we had to understand it as a period of time. First of all, there is a defeat, and then there is a fall. When had it fallen? 1991, the end of the Soviet Union. When is the King of the South defeated? Again, Pyrrhus demonstrates this for us. The Battle of Panium, you could say the Battle of Beneventum, if you wanted to keep to Pyrrhus. When is its fall completed? When is Pyrrhus killed and Tarentum falls? This is Sunday law. So now, Daniel 11 verse 40, it's not talking about the Battle of Raphia. It's talking about the Battle of Panium all the way to Sunday law. So now we can see that in application, 1989 is Panium, not Raphia. So what do we see in 1989? Subversion from the inside, not a hot war. Raphia's back here. It's a small, these waymarks are getting increasingly stronger like birth pangs. Panium is stronger than Raphia. And at Panium it's 1989. Sunday law it's 1991. I don't mean this to be a peace and safety message. We know things are escalating and we're going to be having to do a work in that period now to reach the world. They are stepping up, but still, what are we expecting to see based on prophecy? I would suggest we're not going to see a hot war. This is subversion from the inside via information, propaganda and blackmail. Again, going back to the time of the end shows us our future. It can give us peace because God has already illustrated the end from the beginning, the end of our reform line from the beginning of our reform line. This is, we talk about Raphia and Panium, our close of probation and our second advent, and it's already been typified by 1989 and 1991 and that history. The evidence for what this war looks like has been in place from the beginning. It's been in place since Elder Jeff Pippinger wrote the Time of the End magazine in 1996. What we're doing is not new information. Again, it just ties us back into the studies that were placed in this movement in those early couple of years. All we're really doing is adding some events, but going back and reminding us of that information. This is where we're going to conclude our study in information war. I hope that we're able to watch those documentaries, not in Sabbath hours, not so much Sabbath material, but I hope this gives a little bit more clarity into what we're expecting to see at Raphia and Panium. And we're still going to address that a little bit more tomorrow as we consider time, the element of time as it comes into this message, and also what Vladimir Putin exactly has on Donald Trump, what information he's using. We're going to kneel in prayer and finish in prayer. If you would kneel with me if you can. Dear Father in heaven, thank you, Lord, for all of our blessings. Thank you, Lord, that for this beautiful rain, Lord. Thank you that my voice has been able to hold. Lord, thank you for your Sabbath hours and for the fellowship of brethren, even from far away, Lord, as we get a taste of what heaven will be like, where there will be no national borders, and that we will all meet in union, Lord, before your throne. I pray, Lord, that we'll be prepared to spend eternity with our brethren and eternity studying these things. Thank you, Lord, that you do not leave us in fear or in doubts of what is coming. And I pray, Lord, for further light, for further information to be poured upon your people, that we can be totally prepared. In Jesus' name I pray.